Okay, welcome back. So, this week we're talking about events in the second half of the 1850s that lead to a complete breakdown in American politics and really a breakdown of the United States itself. So, when we left off, we were talking about the Kansas Nebraska Act. Remember, it was determined that Kansas would be able to use popular sovereignty, that is, voting, to determine if it would be slave or free. And this triggered people from both North and South pouring in to the region trying to affect the outcome of the vote. So, as we get further into the 1850s, what we're really seeing is Americans in the North and South are almost living in two completely different political realities. You have in the North, people are convinced that the slave power or the interests of slave owners control the government and want to expand slavery across the country and make the country entirely slave pro-slavery. On the other hand, in the South, people are becoming increasingly convinced that the abolitionists want to take over the government and ban slavery altogether. So both sides just kind of think the other side is maneuvering and conspiring to take over the country and take over the government. So Americans are living in two really different political realities where the political discourse and communication between Americans in different sections really breaks down throughout the 1850s. So we talked about Kansas, Nebraska last week. Remember, there was two separate governments, pro-slavery in Lecompton, anti-slavery in Lawrence, and that led to a bloody conflict that would continue throughout the 1850s. So the results politically of this are many, and one of the main results here in 1854 is the formation of a new party, the Republican Party, which brought together anti-slavery Whigs. Remember, the Whig Party kind of collapsed, and Millard Fillmore was the last Whig president. And the Whig Party kind of collapses, and Democrats, who were anti-slavery, combine with the Free Soil Party, who were interested in limiting the expansion of slavery. So the Republican Party was motivated by the events of Kansas, Nebraska, the Fugitive Slave Act, the growing abolition movement, and this is now a political party that is organized in opposition to slavery. It's a very fundamental part of its platform is that it is against slavery, although more moderate Republicans want to just limit its expansion. More radical Republicans want to get rid of it altogether. But we're seeing now in the 1850s a political party that is formed on the basis of being anti-slavery. So that's a really big development, right? We went from slavery being something that was not even allowed to be being discussed in the House of Representatives to now a political party that actually is anti-slavery and includes abolitionist members. So this shows how American politics was really changing during this time, and slavery was becoming the main political issue. The Republicans ran a presidential candidate for the first time in 1856, but they didn't win. But they're on the map politically. I'll post these slides in Schoology if you want to get a closer look at the different platforms. But moving right along, another development that further divides North and South and inflames tensions is the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. And this isn't Sanford, this is Chief Justice Roger Taney, who wrote the majority opinion in the case. And this case, Scott was an enslaved man who had been brought to a free territory by his owner, who was in the military, and Scott sued for his freedom, basically saying, I have lived on free soil a long time, so I should be a free man, because slavery isn't legal in this state, in Illinois. It's a complicated case, but the upshot is the Supreme Court, led by Taney, makes this extremely racist opinion that says slaves, first of all, are not citizens, so they can't bring suit in court. Slaves are property. Taney also said, quote, the black man has no rights with which the white man is bound to respect. So he goes further and not just ruling against slaves being able to be citizens, but the ruling in Scott versus Sanford actually makes it seem like black people in general cannot be citizens and have equal rights. Slaves are property, and since property is protected by the Fifth Amendment, Congress does not have the power to ban slavery. That would violate, the decision says, Americans' Fifth Amendment right to property. So the ruling goes way far and decides, Taney in the Supreme Court actually say Congress doesn't have the power to regulate slavery at all. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. It's just up to the states to be slave or free. So this really inflamed abolitionists and free soilers, who felt like it was a huge blow to the abolition movement and the movement to keep slavery out of the West. And again, when we're in this time where, Northerners are convinced that the slave power or the kind of slave interests are controlling the government, this ruling seems to confirm that, right? It seems like the Supreme Court is just totally in the pocket of slave owners. So this enrages abolitionists and Northerners, and pushes people more and more to feel like the government is not going to be able to provide a solution to this problem. We can't rely on the Supreme Court to do the right thing. We need to change the people in the government, or we need some more radical solution, because people are losing faith in the government's ability to decide this issue fairly. Of course, the South, on the other hand, was happy with the ruling. It was a very pro-slavery ruling. So it's around this time that Abraham Lincoln really comes on the scene. And Lincoln had served in the House of Representatives all the way back at the time of the Mexican-American War. But in 1858, he runs again, this time for Senate, a Senate seat in Illinois. Lincoln runs now as a Republican. He's no longer a Whig. He's a member of the Republican Party. And his main opponent is Stephen Douglas, who's the Democrat from Illinois, the man who played a big role in the Compromise of 1850 and in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And they have a series of debates that become really significant and important for understanding this time period. You have Lincoln, the Republican, a member of a new political party with a new political perspective, going up against Douglas, who is the guy who's really been the architect of these compromises in the 1850s. He's the popular sovereignty guy. That's kind of his main calling card. So Lincoln loses the election. He doesn't win, but he really puts himself on the map in these debates, including in a very famous speech, his famous House Divided speech, where Lincoln said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I expect it will cease to be divided. So what Lincoln is saying here in this speech, which was given as part of his debates with Douglas, is Lincoln is basically saying the country cannot continue to exist with half free states and half slave states. He says at some point, notice he's being strategic here. He's not saying we're going to go into the South and abolish slavery, but he's saying at some point that the country will have to become either totally slave or totally free. And obviously, from Lincoln's perspective, he wants it to be eventually a totally free country without slavery. So this is obviously very much against Douglas, who thought that popular sovereignty could be used to kind of, and other political compromises along with popular sovereignty could be used to kind of negotiate between North and South and free and slave. And Douglas was very much about kind of, let's just use practical political solutions to keep the country together. Lincoln, on the other hand, says we can't keep doing this forever. We can't keep compromising between free and slave states. Something has to give eventually. And Douglas wins this race, but Lincoln benefits a lot from the exposure and getting his views out there. So a year later, one more event happens that's going to further rock the country and divide it, and that's John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. So John Brown had already been active in Kansas, fighting against pro-slavery forces, murdered 5 pro-slavery men in the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre in 1857. So he's someone who believes that violence is needed to end slavery. He does not believe that words alone or just political debate alone is going to really solve the problem. So Brown, as I think we covered him a bit when we looked at the abolitionists, but this is the point in time, 1859, when Brown executes his plan, or attempts to execute his plan, to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and start a slave revolt that he hopes will spread across the South. So Brown, in 1859, him and his followers attack the arsenal. They try to take over the town. They end up in a gunfight with federal troops, and he's captured. But this John Brown's raid is front page news at the time, even though it doesn't really get off the ground. But this at a time when the country was already so tense and so on the edge. Again, Brown's raid further kind of convinces the South that the North is a bunch of abolitionists who are going to come down here and, start a rebellion and end slavery in the South. So this raid comes at a time when the nation is already really divided, and this kind of confirms what the South had thought, that the North was just a bunch of abolitionists who will stop at nothing to end slavery. So it's important to understand the context in which this raid happens. If this event had happened 30 years earlier, it would have been a big story, but it wouldn't have shook the country to its core the way that it did in 1859. Brown eventually is executed for his crimes after being captured. Here are his famous last words. If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. So Brown became kind of a martyr for the abolitionist cause. He's someone who died for the cause. And was he a terrorist? Was he a hero? His legacy is really complicated, but in a way, his idea that violence would be the only solution for slavery was kind of true, in the sense that it would be the Civil War, an incredibly violent event in which 700,000 people died. It would be the Civil War that actually led to the end of slavery in the United States. But John Brown didn't live to see the Civil War. He was executed. But understanding the timing of this event is very important. It really rocks the country in 1859. So that brings us up to the election of 1860. We have another election now, and this time Lincoln and Douglas are both running for president, along with a few other guys. You have Breckinridge. He's a Southern Democrat who's very strongly pro-slavery. And then you have John Bell, who just basically his whole political platform was just avoid the slavery issue, just keep the country united. You have Douglas, who, again, supported popular sovereignty, wanted the states to be able to decide. And then you have Lincoln, who said slavery should be prohibited in the territories. Slavery should not be allowed to expand west, only should be allowed to continue where it already exists. So Lincoln, notice, not a total abolitionist, just saying contain it. Of course, he thought eventually if you contain it, it will kind of fade away. So anyway, the election of 1860 happens, and you can see from the political map of the election, the country was totally divided along sectional lines. Lincoln won almost all the states in the North. He won Illinois, where Douglas had beat him 2 years ago. And Breckinridge, the most strongly pro-slavery candidate, carries the South. Lincoln, in fact, did not even appear on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. So most of the southern states didn't even give people a chance to vote for him because he was so unpopular in the South. And notice Douglas only wins one state. By this time, Douglas' ideas about popular sovereignty and compromise just really had... People were sick of his platform. They had seen what happened with popular sovereignty in Kansas, and that really hurt Douglas politically. This idea that we can, use popular sovereignty to decide about slavery, really was, that whole idea was kind of destroyed by the Kansas-Nebraska situation and bleeding Kansas. So Douglas loses big time. And Lincoln wins the electoral vote and gets about 40% of the popular vote. So the country is deeply divided. You have a situation where Lincoln wins the race, he's the president, but no one in the South voted for him, and 60% of Americans did not vote for him, even though he got the most votes. So this really showed that there was no more national political parties. There was no unity in across sectional divisions. It was all sectional. The North and South were really two very separate parts politically within the United States. And the South, you know, the South feeling like an abolitionist has been elected president. Really, Lincoln's not exactly an abolitionist. He's a little more moderate, but in the South, that nuance is lost upon them, and they feel like an abolitionist is in power. The slave states don't have any voice in the federal government, and this is when, in the aftermath, South Carolina, followed by other states, votes to secede or leave the United States. They say we can't live in a country where Lincoln, a Republican, is president. We're going to leave and start our own country, independent from the United States. They were followed by 6 more states in the Deep South. This was the beginning of the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy, and also the event that brought on the Civil War. So, in summary, Lincoln is elected November of 1860. A month later, South Carolina secedes, followed by 6 other southern states, and then in April of 1861, about 4 months later, the first shots of the Civil War are fired as South Carolina attacked a federal fort, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. So it was really the break, South Carolina and other states trying to break away from the Union, that started the Civil War. But all of these events throughout the 1850s had played a role in leading up to that point.